In 2024, I read 26 books, which is probably more books in 1 year than I've read in my entire life. And in this video, I'm gonna rank them on a tier list, as well as give you a spoiler-free, sentence-long summary of each book and my personal opinions about them. So even if I rank something low on the tier list, it doesn't mean that it's bad or that you shouldn't read it. It's just my opinion of them at this specific point in time. And that opinion could even change if I reread it in a year or so. I don't know. I'm new to this. Let's get into it. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. S tier. Piranesi is a dude surviving in a humongous house filled with infinite rooms, thousands of statues, and literally storming tides of ocean water. He's there all by himself, but he's visited weekly by a man who he calls the Other, and he soon unravels the truths and secrets of his home. Yeah, so that probably didn't make any sense, right? But all you need to know is that it does make sense once you get chugging along in these pages. This is the first book I read in 2024 in January, and this book made me feel legitimate feelings for the first time maybe ever for a novel. It was the spark that ignited a year of personal reading records. So Piranesi actually started off a little bit slow for me because you're kind of thrown into this story in this incredibly unique setting, which is described beautifully, by the way, and written entirely in first person. You're literally reading Piranesi's journal entries. And once you finish this book, you realize how genius that first person choice was by Susanna Clarke. Just a super, super interesting read. And another plus of this book is it's only 250 pages long. So you kind of breeze through it. 2 thumbs up to Susanna Clarke. I wasn't familiar with your game, but I'm about to be soon because I'm gonna read more of you soon. I'm gonna call you Soonzana because of how soon I'm about to read. Foul ammo! Red Rising by Pierce Brown. S tier, baby. This is a dystopian sci-fi set in a future on Mars where society is divided into this color-coded system where the gold class rules and the red class is at the bottom of the food chain. And we follow Darrow, a miner in the red class, as he infiltrates the gold class and tries to bring justice to his fellow Reds. Red Rising. Rising up the hierarchy. Think Hunger Games meets Game of Thrones. I can't rave about this book enough. I saw it all over BookTok and I decided to give it the old college try. And it honestly might have been the best decision I've made in a long time. I haven't fell so in love with the series since first watching Game of Thrones when it came out. If Piranesi was the spark for me to want to read more, the Red Rising trilogy set that spark ablaze. Darrow, the main character, is just someone you want to root for. My boy's a straight up beast. And the rest of the cast of characters are like so full of life and feel so real in a world that is set in the future on Mars that seems pretty surreal. These characters are crazy, don't get me wrong, but also human. There's a ton of action, cool sci-fi elements, a rags to riches story of sorts, and best of all, what I would call conversational writing that makes you feel every emotion from laughter to cringing at the things that are happening on the page. Because this book is kind of fucked up in a good way, aside from some controversial parts of it. But overall, what is perhaps the most wild thing is that as good as this book is, and it's very good, it is objectively the worst book in the trilogy. They only get better from here, and that's saying a lot. Golden Sun by Pierce Brown and Morning Star by Pierce Brown, aka the rest of the Red Rising trilogy. S tier, capital S tier. This is book number 2 and 3 of the Red Rising series. I didn't read these immediately after the first Red Rising, and I'm kind of doing these in order of when I read them, but I want to clump these together because to give a recap on these 2 books would be to kind of give you some spoilers of the first book. Like, for all you know, Darrow dies in the first book. Or does he? I don't know. And you don't either. And I'm going to keep it that way. Because I'm not going to be the one to spoil these books for you. I'm putting them back. S tier. But before I go, all I'll say is that these books are both amazing. They level up and they introduce new amazing characters while deepening your relationship with the existing characters, while adding more drama and stakes. And I'm not talking about filet mignon. I could talk about those books forever, but read the first one and then we can chat about it, okay? Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. B tier. This is a sci-fi thriller where, hold on. Jason Dessen is thrown into a parallel world, a different path of the multiverse, if you will, and he desperately tries to find his way back to his family in his original timeline. My name's not Francis, but I'm gonna be frank with you, okay? I read this book solely because I knew that there was a show coming out, and I couldn't wait to be the guy who both read the book and watched the show, so I could finally say the 4 words that all readers love to utter. The book was better. Such a great feeling. Highly recommend. But actually, you know, I just remembered like 8 years ago, I read the book Mike and Dave Need Wedding Dates, like the Zac Efron movie. Yeah, I read it. I even bought the movie version of the book. I couldn't read this in public. That would have been weird. I actually think the movie was better than the book in this case, so do with that information as you will. Anyways, Dark Matter is a multiverse story. And although it kind of does feel like the whole multiverse storylines are kind of played out since the Avengers movie and literally every other movie that's come out since, I still would recommend giving this a read because it did not go the way that I thought it would go. I know most books have twists, but this had some twists that I did that were twisted. Put it that way. I didn't see those twists coming. That's what you know. You know a twist is about to come and it still catches you by surprise. That's a good twist. That's a good one of those. Blake Crouch writes in a way that is really easy to understand, and I honestly kind of flew through this book, 340 pages. So it was an easy and enjoyable read and something that I would recommend like taking on a plane ride or a vacation, something that you can kind of just like breeze through, you know? Small Things Like These, Claire Keegan, D tier. This is a poignant novella set in 1980s Ireland, where a coal merchant faces a moral dilemma during Christmas time. And I know what you're thinking. Hey Phil, that sounds a lot different than like every other book that you've had on this list so far. You're exactly right. But the thing about me is I'm a short man who prefers short books. And with this being like 100 pages or so, I was absolutely salivating, just straight up licking my chops. Plus, I did want to expand my genre of books from the fantasy sci-fi sphere. Unfortunately, this book just wasn't for me. I didn't really enjoy it. It was just a little too slow paced and written in a way that I'm sure is beautiful to a lot of people, but for my simple pea brain, it was just like a slog. But it has amazing reviews. And it's actually being adapted into a movie starring Cillian Murphy. So it's doing something right for a lot of people. I'll tell you that. But it just wasn't for me. And that's okay. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, C tier. So this is an oral history of a rock band in the 1970s and their rise to fame. So this is really cool. This book is written in a set of interviews from Daisy Jones and the rest of her band, mucking it up about the good old days and the bad old days. You hear stories of sex, drugs, and rock and roll directly from the famous rock star herself, and her guitarist, her drummer, bassist, agent, her best friend, etc., etc. So what I thought was really fun and cool is that when I read about like the creation of their specific hit songs, I went straight to Spotify so I could actually like listen to what they sounded like. But then something a little fishy happened. I saw that all their songs were from 2023, and that was weird. So then I looked up Daisy Jones and the Six on Google because I'd never really heard of that band, and apparently it's because they never existed. This book is completely fictional. These interviews are fictional interviews and all their songs are from a fictional TV show based on this book. So that was embarrassing to kind of slowly realize. I feel like this is what baby boomers must feel like when they look at AI pictures. Wait, did you say AI? Allen Iverson? All that to say is that that little hiccup of misunderstanding kind of shows how well written this is and how cool of a storytelling strategy like the interview style is. I really liked the character of Daisy Jones. She felt like a real person, you know. Thought she was. Felt like a believable, real rock star based on her backstory and the things that she was doing. But for whatever reason, the story got stale for me about halfway through. I feel like it was just kind of because it was about a band doing band things. It dealt with bigger themes and issues and things like that, but I don't know why. I just feel like I lost interest. It could be because I was just craving another sci-fi fantasy book. But if you're into 1970s like rock or just bands, music in general, I feel like this is a really cool read and worth a read. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, S tier. A lone astronaut must save Earth from an extinction level event by solving a mystery in space. I like recognized this book before buying it and reading it. Like I'd seen the cover, and my brother one time was like yapping about how good it was. The thing is, I knew it was about an astronaut in space and that it was like kind of science-y. So I wasn't like really looking forward to reading it sounded cumbersome. I'm not like the science guy or an astronaut guy. But then I saw Smitty on TikTok praising this book, and he was the one who put me on Red Rising, so I trusted his word. And this book did not let me down. Yeah, it has science. Yeah, it has astronauts. But it's written in a way that is so conversational and relatable that all that science and astronaut jargon isn't hard to follow at all. The main character is just a normal dude who just happens to be really smart and also happens to be a certified goofball. I want to talk so much details about this book, but I don't even want to come close to ruining it for you. I don't know why I'm hiding behind it like this. All I'll say is like there's something in this book that happens that I never in a million years or light years space would expect to happen. And that thing, keeping it general, caused me to keep reading, and I was super invested in it. So bottom line, if you're like me and you think you won't like this book because it's about space and it's about science and it's about astronauts, I'm gonna have to ask you to reconsider and read this book. It's so funny, heart-pounding, and wholesome. And also, the audible narrator is terrific. He's probably the best narrator I've listened to out of like the 5. If you don't feel like physically reading this book, honestly, just pop in some earbuds and listen to that guy tell you what's going on. I wish that guy could narrate my life. The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. C tier. This is a self-help guide on the creative process by the legendary music producer Rick Rubin. So I saw this book, this cover, in so many YouTube videos from Colin and Samir to Life of Riza that I honestly just felt like it was like required reading to be a content creator. So I bought it and I read it because I'm a good little student. This book offers insights into finding inspiration and cultivating artistic expression. But honestly, at this stage of my life, I kind of find like physically reading self-help books hard. It's just not exciting for me. I don't look forward to reading a self-help book at night. So I actually listened to probably half of this book, and it's narrated by the whispering therapeutic voice of Rick Rubin himself. I definitely agree with a lot of what Rick Rubin says in here. He's obviously a genius, and it's cool to get a peek inside of his mind. But honestly, as I remember it, I don't have many tangible takeaways from this book, other than I was pretty happy to be done with it and read something fictional. I personally don't think any advice in here was particularly revolutionary like you might find in Atomic Habits or something. It's just more so a nice reminder of things you probably already know, and it's just like good to reinforce that, which may have been his intent, honestly. I feel like it probably was his intent. Rick Rubin just seems like just like the super chill guy who believes there's creativity bouncing everywhere, and this book empowers people to believe in that too. And you know what, Rick? I believe in you. The creativity bouncing off the walls into me right now. Unfortunately though, it's still a C tier. The Sword of Kaigen, M.L. Wang, S tier. This is a standalone, self-published, character-driven tale about war and resilience, following the Matsuda family as they uncover their powers and painful truths, all while protecting their homeland. Think Avatar: The Last Airbender meets Game of Thrones vibe. Not one, but 2 of my favorite characters are in this novel. Shout out the GOATs, Misaki and Mamoru, and the supporting characters are also as memorable too. This is a big boy book, as you can see. It's like 600 pages. You just spend a lot of time with Misaki and Mamoru and the supporting characters inside of their home and inside of their culture. The story starts kind of small, honestly, but oh brother, does it escalate. The magic system, as you say, in this book is banana land. Some characters can wield water, some characters can wield air, some fire, and like the manner that they use that isn't like Avatar. It's like, or maybe it is, honestly, I've never really seen Avatar, but it's freaking wild. I have never felt such emotional moments in a book like I did about this way through. I physically cried like once in the last 5 years, and this book almost got me a couple times. I'm not gonna lie. He almost got me. You were that close. Really tried to make your boy weep, didn't you? As great as this book is, there is a little bit of a lull somewhere in the middle. Some people say this is because it's self-published. It's not like the traditional fantasy book that has the hero's journey or whatever kind of flow to it. But even though it does get a little slow for 50 or so pages, just power through, please. You're gonna be overjoyed, overzealous even that you did. I'll remember this book forever. I still think about it sometimes, honestly, just randomly. One of the most intense books I've ever read, said Patrick Leo from NovelNations.net. Patrick Couldn't have said it better myself. The Spectacular Now by Tim Tharp. E tier. So this is a coming of age story about a charismatic but self-destructive high school senior. So I remember really loving the movie The Spectacular Now, starring Shailene Woodley and Miles Teller. So when I saw this book in a thrift store for $1, yo boy copped it. Yo boy went, mine. Because I never knew it was a book, honestly, and I figured if I like the movie, I'd like the book. And it might be like a fun break after reading a really intense book, Sword of Kaigen. I already told you I like short books. Just like the movie, this book examines themes of youth, love, the fear of growing up, but it does so in the first person with such an annoying, excruciatingly painful to read main character, Sutter. This book was published in 2008. I know the lingo was different back then, but even so, as someone who was a teenager in 2008, it just could not have been more apparent that this high school senior was actually written by a middle-aged man. Like, the character Sutter literally says words like spanktacular or spankalicious when he's like describing a girl. No shade to Tim Tharp here, because look, I know I can't write Ohio Riz like a Gen Alpha, but that piece of it really took me out of the story from the beginning. I mean, I don't know how I didn't DNF this. The main character was just so insufferable to read. The fact that we only get his point of view throughout the entire story with no breaks of another character's point of view, like Amy's point of view, like you kind of get in the movie, just made this book a book I never enjoyed. More like The Spectacular, if you're asking me. Love the movie though, whenever I saw that. Movie was better. Movie was better. Maybe we're onto something. This and Mike and Dave. Iron Gold by Pierce Brown. B tier. This is the fourth book in the Red Rising saga. So the first series is a trilogy, and you could stop there if you wanted to. But if you had an insatiable appetite for this world and these characters like I did, Pierce Brown's got 4 more books for you. After the devastating read of The Spectacular Now, I needed to go back to my tried and true, my 4-seam fastball of reading the Red Rising series. But this book wasn't up to par with the original trilogy. That was kind of a bummer, and that got me worried that my man Pierce Brown lost his fastball. Without spoiling anything crucial, an interesting and different part of this book versus the rest of the Red Rising series is that you actually read it from 4 characters' point of view, 2 of which are completely new characters to the universe. And other than that kind of big change in the reading of it, this book is a little different than the first trilogy in other ways. It's almost like a political drama with like heists versus kind of like the heart-pumping action that you get in the first trilogy. But overall, Iron Gold is essentially setting the stage for the next 3 books in the series. I just wish the setup book wasn't this long. 581 page setup book, come on. It's still a good read, don't get me wrong. I just hold my man Pierce Brown to 5-star S tier caliber books. Dark Age by Pierce Brown. S tier. Turns out Pierce Brown did not lose his fastball. He was just simply accumulating strength, and his fastball is actually 10 miles an hour faster now. He's like prime Eric Gagne. Dark Age puts the dark in dark. This book is crazy, and the villains in this story are crazy. Everything is crazy. This is also written in multiple POVs, but it's simply like done better or more interesting. The stakes are stakier, the action is actioner, the drama is drama. I wish I could spoil things, but I just won't do it, guys. All I'll spoil is that these books get thick. 751 pages. Can't believe I read this. That's nuts. S tier though. Absolutely tore through that. Read that in like a week and a half. Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. B tier. This is a humorous novel about a bank robbery turned into a hostage situation and all the wacky and zany things that come along with it. So this is a story of misunderstandings, second chances, and the beauty of human connection. Yeah, the beauty of human connection. I think my man Rick Rubin would love this book. The dry humor in this book was a much needed break after reading 2 straight 700-page fantasy sci-fi Red Rising books. I don't have anything bad to say about this at all. It is actually probably on the cusp of A tier. It's very fun, it's very funny, it's great for like an easy vacation read. You know, this could be you on the beach, just doing this, you know? Think about it. Recursion by Blake Crouch. C tier. A New York City police officer and a neuroscientist must work together to defeat a mysterious affliction that causes people to have memories of lives they have never lived. So Blake Crouch impressed me with Dark Matter, so I figured I'd try another one of his books. Like I said, he has like an easy to follow, free-flowing kind of way that he writes. It's fast-paced, and he just does these like psychological thrillers really well. This book hooked me, certainly the premise and the details about what's going on, but for whatever reason it just didn't hit the same as Dark Matter. Like I could see the aspect of what made Dark Matter really enjoyable to me, but for whatever reason it just didn't resonate as much. I didn't care as much for the characters, and I honestly I can't even really remember what happens at the end of this book. Maybe I have the mysterious affliction that causes people to lose memory. Lightbringer by Pierce Brown, S tier. The penultimate book in the Red Rising series, and I'll tell you what, penultimate might be the funnest word to say out loud. Give it a go when you can. So the final book releases this year called Red God. All I can say to this book is W-O-W. That spells wow. Forwards and backwards. 678 pages for the record. Pierce, come on. How long is Red God gonna be? The Will of the Many by James Islington? S tier. This is a dark academia epic fantasy set in a world ruled by hierarchies of power. Instead of Red Rising's colors, these are numbers. A new student with a secretive past must navigate an elite academy to seek his revenge. This kind of sounds just like Red Rising, right? I mean, it kind of is pretty similar, and it's also similar in that it's also an absolute banger. When starting this book, I literally was just like, oh, so that's just Red Rising. Like a young guy is attempting to overthrow the existing hierarchical structure to get vengeance for his family. But honestly, it's so different. It's different in a lot of ways. It almost gives me a like darker version of Harry Potter vibe. Like the mystery, eeriness, magic, it's all there just in like a different package. And I was pleased to learn this is gonna be yet another series. The next book releasing within a year or so. There's so much to say about this book, and I feel like the second one is going to be entirely different than this one. So it's safe to say I can't wait to dive into another 700-page hardcover book that totally isn't a hassle to read and carry around. Yeah, no, it's totally chill. It's whatever. The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. C tier. So this is a dark fantasy following a war orphan who rises through the ranks of her military academy. The Poppy War trilogy is all over BookTok. So it was on my TBR for months, and I finally picked it up, and I'm glad I did. This book surprised me. It was not at all what I expected it to be in terms of like the magic and what it kind of does to people. The author writes so visually that you can practically see the words jump out of the page in front of you when they're like explaining the magic. The main character's name is Rin. She's determined, talented, but vengeful. Boy, is she vengeful. And as the story goes on, you really don't kind of always want to root for her. You don't know who to root for. I mean, you want to root for her, she's the main character, but you don't always. I thought the magic was really cool and almost like hard to read, but like in a good way. It was just like painful. Some of the things that were going on. Rin was really interesting to follow, some of the other main characters, but something just didn't connect for me in this book as much as it did in similar books like Red Rising or The Will of the Many. I just wasn't as invested, and I didn't leave this book desperately wanting to read the second one. I was really expecting to love this book, but I only liked it. That could have been because I read it right after reading Lightbringer and The Will of the Many. So maybe I was just burnt out of that kind of storyline. The Martian by Andy Weir. D tier. An astronaut stranded on Mars must use science, ingenuity, and humor to survive. So this is the same author as the other book about science, humor, and astronauts, Project Hail Mary. The Martian, however, was his first book that was adapted into that 2016 Matt Damon movie. So since I loved Project Hail Mary so much, I had very high expectations for The Martian. It's written in a similar tone with the similar main character, with the similar storyline, but I realized that the unique elements of Project Hail Mary just really separated it from The Martian emotionally, and I'll say no more about the unique elements. You're just gonna have to read Project Hail Mary to discover that. I think if I had read The Martian before Project Hail Mary, maybe I'd feel differently, and maybe I'd like this book a lot more because it'd be fresh and new, but you know, I read it when I read it. Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. B tier. A space opera sci-fi epic about a man who becomes a legendary figure, and he recounts his role in blowing up a sun to end an alien empire. So this book right now is super popular on booktok, booktube, in the fantasy realm, that is. It's kind of the space that I follow the most. This whole series is really popular. It's called the Sun Eater series. I don't know why I said eater. I can see why these are really popular. This book like takes you into a whole new world, a whole new galaxy with intricacies that are so complex. This book gets compared to epic sci-fis like Dune or Name of the Wind, and I can see it, even though I've never read Dune or Name of the Wind, but I've seen the Dune movies, so I feel like I kind of know what they're talking about. The main character, Hadrian Marlowe, is a nobleman who, in his own words, is melodramatic. You're reading Hadrian's journal entries as he's like reflecting on his tumultuous past and actions that led him into blowing up a sun to defeat humanity's enemy. The story he tells takes him far places. He meets countless characters. Villains, the aliens in this story are really super interesting. So I did enjoy this book, don't get me wrong, but to me it was just like a very difficult read. The author writes in a way that I would almost describe like poetic. He like describes everything beautifully and just super detailed. To me, as like a still somewhat newish reader, it reminded me of when people used to say like George R.R. Martin spends 3 pages describing what the inside of a room looks like. It's probably not as extreme as that, but that's what it felt like. Just incredibly detailed in his description of emotions and scenery that it just takes longer to read for a guy like me, because you feel like you can't like miss a word. It's like one of those movies where you have to pay attention 100% of the time. You would assume all this detail would make me feel closer to the characters, but I just don't know why I didn't have a connection with any of them, even Hadrian really. I had a connection with the universe, the lore, the sci-fi elements, the fantastical elements. That's what kept me reading. And the fact that I heard this series, which is like 5 books, gets a whole lot better after this book. And this book is solid, don't get me wrong. I can see why people love it, but I just personally prefer more simple writing because I'm a simple man. I ultimately read the second one later in the year, so stay tuned for that. Constituent Service by John Scalzi. E tier. This is a quick, witty, Audible exclusive about an intergalactic politician dealing with unexpected constituents of their community, aka aliens. So I listened to this whole book while reading another book by the same author, but to explain Constituent Service, it's almost like if the show Parks and Rec had alien townspeople in Pawnee, Indiana, but not as funny. This was a hard listen. Yeah. Did not enjoy it. I don't think I enjoyed it for a single second. So even though I know some people say audiobooks don't count, I'm notching it as a book read because it was outright painful even from start to finish. So I earned it. Wembenyama. Oh. Starter Villain by John Scalzi. D tier. A quirky and comedic story about an ordinary guy who inherits his uncle's supervillain empire. So this is the book by John Scalzi that I was reading while I was listening to the other one. This book was recommended to me on Goodreads, I think, and the concept of it sounded interesting. And I mean, look at this cover. I know they say don't judge a book by its cover, but this one got me. Unfortunately, I don't think this book delivered from an execution standpoint. Just feel like he could have done so much with it, but it just ended up kind of puttering out. Howling Dark by Christopher Rocchio. A tier. Okay, so this is the sequel to Empire of Silence, you know, the other book that kind of looks like it and is also humongous. This one, though, is so much better. It's almost like a totally different genre than the first one. It's way more sci-fi-y. The bad guys in this book really get to shine. And you get like a lot of time with them, where there was a lot of build-up in the previous book. Hadrian, the main character, also kind of steps into his own here. He's a little less whiny and way more badass. The imagery is probably my favorite part here. The world building. It's absolutely insane. Incredibly vivid environments, people, aliens, just makes you kind of think. Like, I can't find much fan art about this book, but I know what everything looks like. It's all in Monog, which is pretty crazy. That just shows how detailed and descriptive this is. Again, people compare this to Dune, and I just watched Dune, so I understand it. Like, it's just a whole world that you're thrown into. I really enjoyed that part of it, but I'm just like grasping for a character that I can root for. But I'll tell you, I loved every second of the bad guys on the page. So this book is right on the cusp of S tier. Such a step up in entertainment value and scale from book one. And I heard the third book, Demon in White, I got it back there somewhere, is supposed to be the best out of the first 3 books. There's 2 more after that. So yeah, I'm excited to continue on, but the only part that is holding me back from diving into the next book right away is that, again, this book was pretty difficult to read. It's just cumbersome. Just so much intricate detail. You're just like sucked into this world of like politics and negotiations and all this stuff. It's just a lot, and some parts are page turners and some parts are slower. It's kind of exhausting. Blood over Brighthaven, M.L. Wang, S tier. A woman attempts to become a prestigious mage in a utopian city that is dependent on magic from mages, and she discovers the dark truth behind her city. This book was so friggin' good. Such a breath of fresh air. After reading such like an epic sci-fi book, Howling Dark, that was 700-ish pages, although this is 400 pages too, it just felt so much shorter and easier to understand. And I think that's due to the writing style. This is like a compact, standalone, easy to follow story that hits every emotion you want it to. And the story just ties up neatly in a nice little bow. It's just like, I needed that. This book touches on themes of like oppression due to gender and social class. The main character is an absolute prodigy, an absolute beast. And we meet another mainish character who's also like a great counterpart to her. So after tearing through this book in literally, I think 5 days, I felt a closeness to these characters in a way that I hadn't felt for characters in like 4 months. I've just been dying for a character I just was invested in, and I got 2 of them. Between this and Sword of Kaigen, M.L. Wang is a must-read author for me. And check that out. How sick is that? The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, A tier. An eccentric detective and her new assistant investigate the murder of an imperial officer in a world full of magic, deceit, and murder. Think if Sherlock Holmes was set in a fantasy world with magic. This was such a unique read. It was funny, intense, and gripping. It was so gripping. The detective in this book, Anna, has got to be one of my favorite characters this year. She brings like comedic relief while uncovering all the important stuff. The main character, though, is kind of a dud. Not sure if that's like on purpose or not, but he's like the straight man in a comedy duo where the detective is kind of like the zany, funny one. Although the personality of the main character is kind of boring, his magical abilities are not boring. Yeah, this was just a blast of a read. Loved it, but just not at the same caliber as some of the S tiers. Apparently, this is another trilogy. I feel like with any fantasy book, when you start a new fantasy book, you're just signing yourself up for at least 2 more books after that in the series, which I'm not mad about. Mistborn, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, S tier. In a world ruled by a tyrannical immortal man, a street thief discovers she has rare magical power and joins a daring rebellion to overthrow the empire. My first Brandon Sanderson book. Yeah, reading fantasy, and this is my first Sandersy. So if you read fantasy, you know about Brandon Sanderson. But I'd always been kind of like too scared to read one of his books because they're typically humongous. Told you, short book guy. Completely out of my element this year. Mistborn seems to be like the book that everyone recommends when like to get into Brandon Sanderson. It's apparently a good first step into his Marvel Cinematic Universe of books called the Cosmere. Apparently it's like 11 or so books that are all related in some way. As you can tell, I'm sure someone's screaming at the screen hearing me describe this, but I haven't read them, guys, so I don't know what the Cosmere is. I just know it's a thing. This book was amazing, and I cannot wait to dive into the Cosmere. The magic system in this just makes so much sense. Described in like it was initially described how the magic works in the book over like a couple pages, and I had to reread it like 3 times. Like, oh man, am I gonna understand this? Like I didn't quite get it. And then it's described again in like 20 pages. I feel like that was on purpose. Some of these books, you know, you think you can miss things and you don't understand what's going on, but Brandon Sanderson almost like makes sure you understand the magic. The characters are so clear and distinctive. They have such personality and separate qualities, so you don't get like characters mixed up with each other or anything like that. The plotting, politics, and action just never stops. Prose in this book is just really easily digestible. If you were to write like exactly how I want to read a book, it's either this or Red Rising in terms of the writing style. He creates this world and this hero and this villain that is just so memorable. I would recommend this to any beginner who wants to dip their toe into the world of fantasy. I would even obviously recommend this to experienced readers, and no experienced readers read this still. It's something everyone would like, which is why it's so popular. And yeah, it's about 500 pages, but that's kind of short for a fantasy book, and it flies by. So that's it, 2024. What an amazing year of reading. I especially loved entering the world of sci-fi and fantasy. Let me know what other kind of videos you want to see on my channel. Earl Boykins. Yup.